On a June evening in 1882, a man sat alone in a silent Scottish manse, enveloped in a double darkness. The first was physical, the result of a total, irreversible blindness that had stolen his sight at the dawn of his youth. The second darkness was emotional, the sudden, crushing weight of absolute isolation brought on by his sister's wedding day, which resurrected the painful memory of a fiancée who abandoned him. She had abandoned him years prior because of his impairment. Yet, within 5 minutes, out of this profound void of light and human companionship, this lonely man wrote. The Reverend Dr. George Matheson penned a hymn of such fierce, defiant hope that it would go on to comfort millions across the globe for generations to come. The intellectual landscape of late 19th century Scotland was a fierce crucible of competing paradigms where traditional faith directly confronted the disruptive waves of scientific advancement and industrial modernity. At the epicenter of this ecclesiastical and cultural evolution stood the Reverend Dr. George Matheson, who lived from 1842 to 1906, a minister whose life and work offer a profound exploration into human resilience. He explored the resilience of the human spirit and the adaptability of Christian vocation. Though frequently remembered in contemporary devotional circles primarily for his enduring hymnody, Matheson was truly outstanding. He was fundamentally a premier intellectual architect within the Church of Scotland. His biography is not merely a sentimental narrative of triumph over this severe, permanent physical adversity. His life was rather a rigorous testament to the integration of classical orthodoxy with modern philosophical systems. This approach allowed him to bridge the intense cultural anxieties of his era. Becoming completely blind at the dawn of his ministerial career, Matheson transformed what society deemed an insurmountable liability into an extraordinary catalyst for deep internal reflection and theological innovation. Today, we examine the complex interplay between his institutional positioning, his progressive physical impairment, his collaborative scholarly methods, and the rich mystical theology that defined his brilliant historical legacy. By analyzing his journey, one gains insight into the broader anxieties and transitions of the Victorian religious mind. This framework shapes our entire historical exploration of his work. George Matheson's ministerial and intellectual identity took root during the 1860s and 1870s, a turbulent period of rapid urban modernization for the Church of Scotland. This environment demanded a shift from insular parochial structures toward an intellectually robust presence. Matheson's alignment with the established state church provided a national platform to preach. He used this platform to shape religious discourse during profound cultural shifts. His appointments to critical urban centers, notably the prestigious St. Bernard's Church, gained attention. These roles thrust him into contact with Scotland's cultural and intellectual elite, requiring a sophisticated homiletical methodology that was both intellectually defensible and spiritually vital. The foundation of Matheson's unique theological synthesis came from his academic training at the University of Glasgow, where the brilliant young student encountered British idealism. Championed by neo-Hegelians like Principal John Caird, this philosophy provided the conceptual tools to bridge the growing chasm between traditional Christian revelation and modern scientific inquiry. While Charles Darwin's evolutionary theories drove much of the religious establishment into defensive isolation, Matheson utilized Caird's framework to argue his progressive points effectively. He argued that intellectual advancements were not hostile to spiritual truths, viewing history and nature as progressive self-disclosures of the divine mind within our changing world. This background propelled Matheson into the vanguard of the Broad Church movement, which sought liberation from the rigid constraints of traditional Westminster Calvinism of the past. Rejecting an austere, legalistic framework dominated by strict decrees, Matheson advocated for an inclusive, Christocentric paradigm that transformed the religious practice of his era. This redirection prioritized the internal experience of divine love over static orthodoxy, offering a sanctuary for those wrestling with the deep waves of Victorian skepticism. The trajectory of Matheson's life cannot be untangled from the reality of his physical body, specifically the onset of progressive amaurosis, a complete decay of the optic nerve. This clinical condition began to manifest during his youth, forcing an early and radical restructuring of his relationship with his physical environment. The means by which he navigated his academic obligations required an immediate abandonment of visual methodologies long before his public ministry had even commenced. By the time he faced ordination, his blindness had become absolute. Standing before a packed congregation in total physical darkness meant operating from a position of profound vulnerability. He could not read the faces of his parishioners, gauge their emotional responses, or visually anchor himself within the architectural space of the sanctuary. This physical isolation was soon compounded by a devastating socio-relational fracture. On the cusp of entering public ministry, his fiancée abruptly broke their engagement, stating explicitly that she could not endure a life bound to a blind man. This rejection was not merely an isolated personal tragedy. It directly reflected the broader cultural biases of the Victorian era, which routinely categorized severe physical disability as an unmitigated professional and personal liability. The mechanism by which Matheson processed this double trauma, the loss of his sight and the collapse of his domestic aspirations, served as an existential catalyst for his theology. Cut off from external sensory data and social validation, his intellectual and spiritual energies were forced entirely inward. This forced introspection birthed a distinct internal mysticism. The depth of his sermons shifted from standard academic exposition to an intimate, contemplative exploration of the divine presence within human suffering. His blindness, which threatened to silence him, ultimately granted him a rare, empathetic authority that deeply captivated a Victorian public intimately familiar with grief and hidden pain. George Matheson's entry into the ministry of the Church of Scotland was obstructed by significant institutional gatekeeping. In 1866, his appearance before the Presbytery of Glasgow for his trials for license became an unprecedented administrative and theological battleground. The standard examination required candidates to demonstrate flawless fluency in church history, systematic theology, and biblical languages, typically utilizing open texts and written papers. Because Matheson could not consult physical books, his examination had to be conducted entirely through oral defense, demanding an extraordinary level of mental retention and cognitive mapping. Beyond intellectual capability, Matheson faced deep bureaucratic skepticism regarding the practical execution of pastoral duties. Church officials debated whether a blind minister could validly and safely administer the sacraments, such as pouring the water for baptism or distributing the elements of the Lord's Supper, without disrupting liturgical order. The presbytery had to wrestle with the legal, canonical, and liturgical precedents of ordaining an individual with total amaurosis. Matheson's persistence forced the church to broaden its institutional definitions of accessibility. To prove his competency, he accepted an initial placement at a small chapel in the coastal village of Inalon. This rural parish served as a crucial proving ground. Here, he perfected highly structured mnemonic techniques, memorizing entire liturgical services, scripture readings, and prayers so flawlessly that visitors often did not realize he was blind. The undeniable success and growth of his ministry at Inalon effectively silenced his critics, paving the way for his transition to major urban centers and establishing a historic precedent for disabled clergy within Presbyterianism. By the mid-1880s, Matheson's homiletical power had extended far beyond local Scottish parishes, culminating in an event that marked the absolute pinnacle of imperial and ecclesiastical validation. In 1885, he received a royal summons from Queen Victoria to preach before the royal court at Balmoral Castle. This invitation signaled that his unique theological voice had transcended regional Presbyterian boundaries, elevating him to a position of national and imperial significance. For this critical address, Matheson selected the Book of Job as his theological focus. Rather than offering a detached academic treatise on the nature of theodicy, he chose to deliver a sermon entitled The Patience of Job, which blended profound doctrinal insights with the raw experiential realities of human suffering and divine sovereignty. He spoke as a man who had personally navigated the depths of darkness and rejection, contextualizing Job's loss through the lens of processed personal trauma. Queen Victoria, who was herself deeply mired in prolonged mourning following the death of Prince Albert, found profound solace in Matheson's perspective on the redemptive potential of sorrow. The impact of the sermon was so significant that the Queen issued a royal directive commanding its official publication and nationwide distribution. This imperial endorsement instantly expanded his readership across the British Empire, embedding his Christocentric theology into the broader cultural fabric of Victorian religious life. For Matheson, this moment served as a striking historical counter-narrative to his early life. The man who had been discarded by his fiancée and questioned by his own presbytery as a professional liability was now officially celebrated by the world's most powerful monarch. The immense scholarly and literary output achieved by Matheson throughout his career was made possible by his construction of a highly structured, collaborative academic methodology. Because he lacked independent sight, his work depended entirely upon a lifelong partnership with his sister. She chose to reorient her own life to serve as his primary academic eyes, reader, and secretary. This was not a passive administrative role. To effectively facilitate his research, she mastered both Latin and Greek. This linguistic competency allowed her to read dense historical critical research, German theological treatises, and original biblical commentaries aloud to him, keeping him on the cutting edge of contemporary scholarship. To process this massive influx of auditory data, Matheson cultivated advanced mnemonic protocols. He organized his thoughts, book chapters, and sermons into elaborate mental grids before ever uttering a word to a scribe. When entering the pulpit, he delivered complex, multi-point expository narratives entirely without the use of physical notes or braille aids. This gave his preaching an incredibly direct, conversational, and engaging quality that set him apart from his peers, who were often bound to written manuscripts. Through this scholar-pastor model, Matheson demonstrated to the wider academic community that physical dependency does not equal intellectual deficiency. His methodology challenged the hyper-individualism of late Victorian academia, providing a brilliant case study in how communal collaboration and shared intellectual labor can bypass severe physical limitations to produce timeless theological scholarship. Though Matheson wrote numerous theological volumes, his most enduring contribution to global Christianity occurred on the evening of June 6, 1882, during a moment of profound domestic vulnerability. His sister, the primary academic companion, reader, and emotional anchor who had enabled his ministry, was married that day. After the wedding festivities concluded and the family had departed, Matheson was left entirely alone in the manse, facing a sudden vacuum of support and companionship. This transition served as an intense existential trigger. The reality of his sister's new life forced him to directly confront his own permanent bachelorhood and resurrected the painful, repressed memories of his broken engagement from decades prior. Sitting in absolute physical and emotional darkness, he experienced a profound wave of loneliness. It was out of this acute psychological crisis that he penned the legendary hymn, "O Love That Wilt Not Let Me Go." Matheson later recorded that the entire hymn was completed in less than 5 minutes, describing the experience not as an act of calculated composition, but as an intense passive dictation from an external spiritual force. O love that wilt not let me go, I rest my weary soul in thee. I give thee back the life I owe, that in thine ocean depths its flow may richer, fuller be. A close textual analysis of the lyricism reveals that the hymn is a highly concentrated distillation of his broad church theological framework. Each of the four stanzas moves systematically through a precise theological progression. Stanza 1, Trinitarian agape, experiential metaphor, resting a weary soul in ocean depths. Stanza 2, epistemological illumination, experiential metaphor, tracing a rainbow through the rain and blindness. Stanza 3, redemptive pain, experiential metaphor, reclaiming a flash of joy out of profound sorrow. Stanza 4, cruciform theology, the cross, experiential metaphor, lifeless dust lifting its head to blossom immortally. Rather than offering cheap comfort, the hymn argues that spiritual surrender requires passing through suffering, translating his complex systematic theology into an accessible song of absolute trust. The enduring significance of George Matheson lies in his successful synthesis of late Victorian evolutionary philosophy with Christian mysticism. At a time when the intellectual world was deeply anxious about the implications of Darwinism, Matheson's major works, such as Can the Old Faith Live with the New?, provided a vital path forward. He demonstrated that modern scientific progress did not require the abandonment of historic faith. Instead, he repositioned evolution as the structural methodology through which the divine mind progressively unfolds itself within the material world. Furthermore, his life established a towering historical precedent for accessibility and adaptive scholarship in higher education. Long before institutional frameworks for disability accommodations existed, Matheson proved that sensory impairments could be successfully mitigated through structured mnemonic development and collaborative community networks. His biography remains a foundational case study in disability history, showing that the academic mind can thrive brilliantly when supported by a dedicated communal infrastructure. Ultimately, while his dense systematic and philosophical treatises eventually became historical artifacts of the Victorian era, his devotional writings and hymnody achieved permanent ecumenical canonization. O Love That Wilt Not Let Me Go outlived the localized academic debates of his day, remaining a staple of global hymnals across various theological spectrums. By prioritizing authentic human vulnerability over sterile academic performance, Matheson redefined the standards of the Scottish pulpit, leaving a permanent blueprint of inward hermeneutics that proves the most profound theological exposition often originates from deeply processed personal suffering. The legacy of George Matheson challenges the modern tendency to view physical limitation or deep personal trauma as an absolute barrier to intellectual and spiritual fulfillment. His journey forces an examination of the systemic gatekeeping still present within institutional structures, as well as the deep resilience required to convert external isolation into profound internal insight. When faced with unexpected darkness, do we retreat into defensive dogmatism, or do we allow our suffering to break open a more inclusive, empathetic framework for understanding the world? Ultimately, are the greatest intellectual contributions born from pristine, unblemished circumstances, or are they forged in the quiet, agonizing crucibles of our deepest vulnerabilities? Join us next week as we dive into Charles Spurgeon, the depressed prince of preachers. We will move from the physical darkness of late 19th century Scotland to the profound, emotional, and psychological battlefields of Victorian London, examining how one of the most prolific voices in church history navigated relentless clinical depression from the pulpit. If you want to ensure you never miss an episode in this series exploring the intersection of faith, history, and human impairment, subscribe to Theology Today. Hit the notification bell to stay updated as we continue to unpack the deep historical and theological architectures of the world's most influential minds.